Welcome to Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute, hosted by Georgina Downer. On the 10th of December 1949, 75 years ago today, Robert Menzies' Liberal Party beat Ben Chifley's Labor government in the federal election. Now, why was this important? Well, it was the first time that the Liberal Party had won an election, and the Liberal Party had only been created just 5 years before in 1944. This election then heralded 23 years of unbroken coalition government, 16 of which were led by Prime Minister Robert Menzies. So joining me to discuss this historic election and all the whys and wherefores of it, Zach Gorman, the Robert Menzies Institute's historian, and Andrew Kemp, a writer and economist based here in Melbourne. Welcome to you both.
It's great to be here. Thank you. Good to be here.
So, Zach, why is the 1949 election such an important watershed in our political history?
I'm glad of that phrasing that you used, such an, rather than the most important, because I just had a comment on a LinkedIn post arguing that the 31 election where Lions came in was the more important watershed. So these things are always open to debate. But I think it ultimately boils down to the fact that you had two really contrasting visions for what Australia would be, and also really well-developed visions for what Australia should be, because you had gone through the Second World War. You'd had this essential pause in ordinary politics, and that pause gave both sides of politics an incredible amount of thinking time to think about what they wanted the nation to look like. Obviously, Menzies did that through his Forgotten People radio broadcasts. Labor developed its very extensive program of post-war reconstruction, and that was framed as this sort of clash between liberalism and socialism, what role the state would have in the post-war world. But equally, Menzies liked to frame it as this clash between security and progress, which is an interesting one today, because you wouldn't think that Labor would be the side of security and Liberal would be the side of progress. But that was his argument, that Labor was really looking backwards to the Great Depression. It really wanted to create as much economic security as possible, and by that, he meant divide up the pie. Whereas Menzies' argument was that Australia was a young nation. It needed to continue to develop. You needed to grow the pie and have progress, which ultimately came from individual initiative.
Yeah, I guess the Great Depression of the 1940s really haunted Labor, didn't it? Well, I'm sure some of the Liberal MPs as well. The difficulties that Australia had gone through then, they just didn't want to let that happen again. So the two parties were finding solutions, and they were very, very different, ideologically different. I mean, we don't talk about socialism as a sort of mainstream political project and political idea these days, but it was very much on the ballot paper, wasn't it, with the Chifley Labor government, and Menzies offering a starkly different approach in his liberalism.
And it's also not just in Australia. I mean, the international context is really important, because you had Clement Attlee win the 1945 UK election and implement a really socialist program. I mean, the level of nationalisation that was going on in Britain puts Chifley to shame. He was far more sort of the avid socialist Attlee, partly because he didn't have a written constitution to deal with to actually block him from doing a lot of these things. But it really demonstrated that these things were politically possible at the time. And had Chifley won, there would have been further attempts to hugely increase the role of the state in not just the economy, but in people's everyday lives.
Yeah, I mean, this election really is it's a sliding doors moment, isn't it? But before we get on to some of those implications, Andrew, this election was the second attempt of Menzies Liberals to win an election. Obviously, they get there in 49, but 1946, which was the first election that the Liberal Party faced, was a pretty big failure for them. Why was that?
It was. And the reaction to the 46 election by Liberals is really interesting, because it was a huge disappointment to the Liberals, like you say, and a particular psychological blow to Menzies for a couple of reasons. I mean, he put a lot of effort into the 46 campaign. By all accounts, he was physically exhausted by the end of it. And not just the physical effort, but the intellectual effort that went into 46. He and the organisation put a lot of work into developing a comprehensive policy program. his 46 campaign speech was in many ways the best campaign speech he gave in his career, 49 included, because he was trying to do a few things at once. I mean, he was trying to articulate an alternative form of government, as every opposition leader does in a campaign speech, but he's also introducing a new political party. And most importantly, he was trying to redraw the battle lines of Australian politics between liberalism and socialism. And really, that was a revival of something that had effectively stopped 30 years ago with the fusion Liberals merging into Hughes' National Labor Party. And Menzies is trying to revive those battle lines. And that makes the speech uniquely philosophical in a way that was different then, and it's certainly different today. And the last line of the 46 campaign speech was, "Liberalism brings to us the only real hope of a free, friendly and prosperous and growing Australia." And I think that explains why the disappointment was so intense amongst Liberals, was because they put forward their philosophical platform and the Australian electorate either weren't listening or they were listening and they weren't convinced by it, because it was a convincing Labor win. It was about 54-46, the two-party preferred. The coalition needed about 13 seats to win. They win 5 from Labor, 1 from an independent. And Menzies has a difficult 11 months after the 46 campaign. There's obviously leadership speculations. In Alan Martin's biography, he records this fascinating conversation Menzies has with Owen Dixon, who's a Justice of the High Court, in January of 1947. And Menzies says to Dixon, "Look, I don't even know if a Liberal Party in Australia will be a relevancy in the future. And maybe the big battle will be between a traditional Labor Party and a more militant, radical pro-communist party." And that pessimism you can explain away perhaps with a degree of self-pity and exaggeration, but in its historical context, I don't think is that outlandish. The fusion Liberals have to merge with Hughes' National Labor Party in the 20s. They're led by Joe Lyons, a Labor man in the 30s. The anti-communists split from Labor in the 50s. So it's a very real threat. And ultimately, what changes his fortunes is firstly Chifley's bank nationalisation announcement, which transforms the organisation and gives substance to the principles Menzies was talking about in 46. And the international context is the communist subjugation of Central and Eastern Europe, which obviously makes the Liberal Party put forward the proposal of banning the Communist Party of Australia. And suddenly they have the resources and the intensity to fight a very unique campaign in 49.
Was there a sense in 46 that Chifley should be rewarded post-World War II too? That, we'd got out of World War II and we're the victors, and he had obviously taken over very suddenly after the tragic death of John Curtin. Was there a bit of sympathy for Chifley, or at least sort of he deserves a go out of the war?
I think so. So that election is September 46. So Japan only really surrendered 12 months ago. So Australians aren't expecting wartime controls and rationing to disappear overnight. No. It's interesting, if you read the political commentary of that time, there's a sense of public apathy to politics. Attendance at political rallies of both sides of politics are quite low compared to previous elections. Conversely, the attendance at the Royal Melbourne Show, which happens around the same time, is in record numbers. So Australians just want to get on with life.
They want to party.
They do, yeah.
That's fair enough after a very long war.
Yeah.
Zach, for the 49 election, apart from obviously, as Andrew was saying, the bank nationalisation issue, which I know you've said before, Andrew, written before, it really kind of makes the Liberal Party, and Chifley sort of makes the Liberal Party a winnable machine because of his bank nationalisation policy. But what were the other issues in play in that 49 period?
Well, there's a few that sort of really play into Menzies' narrative of liberalism versus socialism. So Labor's interventions in the economy are not just bank nationalisation. There are attempts at nationalising the air travel. There's attempts at nationalising healthcare, so it would be public only. There were great expansions in this government fleet of commercial shipping, so the government would control shipping. But the thing that really affected people the most was petrol rationing, which is something that Chifley had just reintroduced right before the election. And the reason he was doing it might surprise a lot of people, because it was actually to benefit Britain. Chifley was still very pro-empire, as was the whole of the Labor Party at the time. And the empire basically was part of this one currency group called the Sterling Bloc. And there were a limited amount of US dollars that the Sterling Bloc could use to purchase oil, which was necessary to end petrol rationing. But this fact that something that was introduced very reluctantly, I mean, Menzies lost so much political capital to introduce petrol rationing in 1940. A lot of people were apathetic about the war, thought it wasn't needed, all the rest of it. That was being kept as late as 1949. In fact, being reimposed as late as 1949 really fed into a narrative that Labor were not willing to get rid of wartime controls, but they actually saw the war as a great opportunity. They liked the expansion of the role of the state that had gone on during wartime, and they weren't really willing to reduce taxation to anywhere even approaching pre-war levels, all these sorts of things.
I mean, the increase in the cost of living in that period leading up to the 49 election is pretty dramatic too. I think it increases between 47 and 49 by 18%, which must have hurt everyday people.
Oh, it hurt immensely. And the Chifley government solution was in 1948 to hold a referendum on price controls. I mean, there's sort of economic illiteracy as far as not appreciating the absolute necessity of raising production, and that the only way you could really raise production was to increase incentive and to liberalize the economy, all the things that we're failing to do at the moment. That these were really dire circumstances, and it really fed into Menzies' forgotten people narrative as well, because Menzies framed inflation as a moral crisis, because inflation punished those who had done the right thing. It punished those who had put away for a rainy day and built up savings and wanted to save for a house. And they were being punished by having their dollars worth less, whereas someone who was just on an award wage, they would get the automatic adjustment with inflation and it wouldn't affect them tangibly at all.
I mean, you talk about petrol rationing. Another energy issue, if we kind of put it in more modern day terms, is the coal strikes that were taking place, and they were severe, weren't they?
They were so severe that it was a 7-week coal strike, particularly located in New South Wales, but also extending outwards in 1949. And it was so bad because this affected all levels of the economy, because without coal, you didn't have electricity, you didn't have trains. The whole of New South Wales ground to a halt. And it got so bad that Chifley, the union man, the man who had sort of fallen on his sword during the Great Strike of 1917, during the First World War, he sent in the army to work the coal mines. That's how desperate it was to get coal. And because the leaders of the coal mining unions were also avowed communists, it fed into Menzies' wider narrative around the need to go hard on the communism issue.
Andrew, you've written about the history of the Liberal Party's organisation in our book, Unity and Autonomy. What was it? What were those key elements that the Liberal Party put together to be a successful election fighting machine?
Yeah. So by 1949, the party has time and money, which they didn't have a lot of in 46. So time, because the organisation is now several years old. They've been tested in the 46 election. State divisions have been tested in state elections. So they have the opportunity to iron out some of the deficiencies that they had identified in 46, and foremost of which I think was candidate selection. This was the big criticism that Thomas Malcolm Ritchie, the federal president, talked about at the end of the 46 campaign, was the need for good quality candidates. And this in many ways is the great achievement of the 49 victory. On top of the leadership of Robert Menzies is this new generation of 49ers who enter Parliament. And they didn't just come walking out from the street out of nowhere. A lot of effort went across the states to find good quality candidates. So, for example, New South Wales, John Carrick, who was then the General Secretary of the New South Wales Division, he has this great reminiscence of hopping in an old car with Bill Spooner, who was the president of the New South Wales Division, and they drive around the state and they just look for people to run for Parliament.
The talent scouts.
Scouts.
Yeah.
And so he has the story of they visit Scone, New South Wales, the country town, and they just go to people on the street and say, do you know anyone who's of our side of politics? And one of them says, look, there's this farmer, Alistair McMullen, down the road. I think he's on your side. You should talk to him. So they hop back in their car and they go down to this farm and they knock on the door and they walk in and Alistair's sitting by the fire and they convince him to start the Scone Liberal branch. It's a success, and then eventually Carrick convinces him to run for the Senate. And Alistair McMullen has the record today of the longest serving president of the Federal Senate. Now, that story doesn't happen at all if people like Carrick and Spooner don't put in the groundwork of finding people. And that story replicates throughout Australia. So after the 49 election, you've got 38 new-timers join the Liberal Party as Liberal Party members of Parliament. The average age is about 43. 29 of them are ex-servicemen. They're professionals, they're idealistic, and they set the party up for a generation of success. So that is, I think, the great achievement of the organisation, which is partly also a result of the effort going in to make it a truly mass political party, which the UAP, the prior Liberal non-Labor outfit, was. And the second element, of course, is money. And the federal president, Richard Casey, has enormous success in raising money after the bank nationalisation announcement by Chifley. And he spends it in a very clever way, which is to poach the Labor Party's public relations agency, the Hanson-Rubinson agency. And they use that money to run a very unique campaign, which in many ways hasn't been replicated since. For example, the John Henry Austral radio series.
Oh, yeah.
Which is an extraordinary effort, effectively a weekly series of, I guess you'd call them radio plays, narrated by a fictional character, John Henry Austral, who is, I suppose, an upstanding middle-class professional Australian who loves private enterprise and doesn't like communism. And his narration is usually followed by a play which deals with some problem in Australian society. So the first episode of the series, mothers trying to line up to buy the basic necessities of the home, food, bread, soap. And the story is effectively, look, these wartime controls, these restrictions are taking away family time. They're causing mental and physical anguish amongst Australians. This is just not the Australian way of life. And they don't criticise Chifley. They don't say how great the Liberal Party is. They just sort of subtly put these ideas into people's minds and sort of shift, we'd call it today, the vibe. They're trying to change the vibe of Australian political culture. And it was a very clever series. It ran for about 18 months. So it's a long campaign. It's not just starting at the beginning of the 49 election campaign. It starts in the beginning of 1948. And I think that is an example of the very different and well-organised campaign that the Liberals were able to run in 49 compared to 3 years earlier.
And a plug for Melbourne University's archives. You can actually listen to those radio plays on the archives here at Melbourne University. So we'll make sure we have a link to that in the show notes when we put this online. What about marketing the leader? Because, Robert Menzies had a go as Prime Minister, 39 to 41. He'd stood down. It basically hadn't been a very successful first effort, and he had some, I think he would have admitted, deficiencies in his leadership style, management of the backbench and the like, and the coalition.
Yep.
How was it for the Liberal Party's organisation to, and I guess the ad campaign as well, to market someone who had already been proven a less than great leader once again to be put up? And was it a sort of a presidential style campaign then, or was it more this is a Liberal Party and, okay, Robert Menzies happens to be our leader, but he's just one of a whole team?
Yeah. There's definitely an element of the presidential campaign because the feeling is that, so this is 1949. Menzies is not the great Menzies we know of today. He's still, to a lot of Australians, the failed Prime Minister who was replaced by John Curtin. Yeah. So a lot of effort goes into trying to bring Menzies' good qualities to the attention of the Australian public. So I mentioned the Hanson-Rubinson agency before. Another one of their recommendations is to attach a journalist to Menzies, a guy called Stuart Howard, and he follows Menzies throughout Australia. He encourages Menzies to go on an Australia-wide tour, but not just to marginal electorates or Liberal electorates, but to electorates that he probably isn't going to win in 49, and mix with factory workers, trade unionists, and importantly, have his photograph taken while he's doing it, sharing a beer, having a laugh. They publish...
Is it sort of Donald Trump at McDonald's? Is that what they're trying to do?
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Yeah. So they want to take away this image of Menzies as the aloof patrician and relabel him as a more down-to-earth Australian, which in many ways he is. He's an amiable person and they want to bring that out to the public. And they publish a pamphlet, How Well Do You Know This Man?, which lists all the homely qualities of Menzies. And
like what? Mean cake maker.
Good family man.
Oh, good.
Humble from a scholarship boy, came from Japarit, worked his way up to make his own success. Yeah. And this is something I think even Menzies himself acknowledged had to be done, because for a lot of people, particularly in a division like New South Wales, still to an extent viewed Menzies as damaged goods. Yeah. So he had to prove himself not just to the Australian public, but to his own Liberal base. Yeah.
So it's always interesting to pore over the election results. Well, I mean, I say that. It's interesting for me, probably you, but maybe not everyone. But anyway, for the psephologists in the audience, tell me about the result in 1949. Was it a landslide, and where did Menzies win?
Well, it's interesting because it's sort of two stories being told simultaneously. So the two-party preferred says 51-49, which is a comfortable victory, but it's hardly a landslide. But the primary vote actually shows a really comfortable coalition victory. The primary vote is 50.3% coalition to 46% Labor. So they're basically saying that everyone who voted independent or for the Communist Party or for Jack Lang's anti-communist Labor Party, they're all preferencing Labor over the coalition. But it's sort of hard to know because back then they didn't actually exhaust preferences if they didn't need to, so we don't have accurate figures for a lot of seats. But then when you break it down into state by state, Menzies wins 4 states. He doesn't win in New South Wales, and he doesn't win in South Australia, which is interesting because that had been the real basis of Menzies' support in the 40s. And even Victoria, it's only slim. It's something like 50.3% two-party preferred. But it's Queensland that didn't even have a Liberal Party until 1949. It was called the People's Party. They win, I think it's like 57% of the two-party preferred. And they're already in 46 being the only state that the Liberals have done, or the People's Party have done reasonably well in. They were the only state where they won senators in 43. So Queensland, like today, is the real heart of the coalition. It's
interesting too. So there's a new influx of seats at this 49 election. And so a lot of seats where, say, there was a sitting ALP member, when the electorate's chopped up, there's a sense that the incumbent Labor MP sticks with the safer side of the seat, and then the new part of the seat that might not be so easy to win is given to an inexperienced new candidate, and that might have been also one of the reasons they did so badly.
Yeah, so it's part of Labor folklore that it was sort of selfish people within their own party that are responsible for letting Menzies in. And it is that benefit of incumbency is one of the strongest thing that a government has. And part of that incumbency is your incumbency as your local member, the fact that people know your face, know your name, and they're more likely to elect you the second time round. Well, if you take the safe side of these seats that are split in half, and they split in half by Labor's own volition. Labor decided to double the size of the House of Representatives because they thought it would benefit them. They thought it would sandbag them. But what it ended up doing was in all these new seats, you basically had a completely fresh contest where both sides of politics were putting up new candidates. And the Liberals, one thing I would say about what they did in candidate selection is they weren't afraid to go young. Menzies was 9 years younger than Chifley, and there's something like a dozen or maybe slightly less than that Liberal MPs under 30 that are elected in 1949. They're really pitching to the future, to the youth vote, whereas Labor is more looking at the 30s and the Depression and these things that the war generation maybe experienced as kids, but they don't have that sort of tangible attachment of lived experience as an adult with it.
And that's something interesting about this election is how the Liberal Party is the party of the younger voter. And I think that, that's sort of been lost somewhat to the annals of history, that there was this real sense of these young people coming back from the war that they wanted something fresh and new. And this was fresh and new.
Fresh and new, and also it proposed to build Australia. There was an optimism, a confidence about the Liberal pitch. And that really appealed to ex-soldiers because they had just fought in a war. Nothing that civilian life had in front of them would be as challenging as what they had already experienced. So as Menzies said, that prioritizing security above all else, it really didn't appeal to that generation. It just wasn't the pitch to make. And the other thing to mention, if we're talking about demographics, is that also Menzies is said to have done particularly well with the female vote, having had that electoral pitch around child endowment that Enid Lyons had been responsible for, and really talking about the home and particularly budgeting, because cost of living at the time in the 1940s, it arguably affected women more than it did men, because men would earn the salary, but then give it over to the wife and say, you look after this, dear, this is your responsibility to do the shopping, all the rest of it. So they had to do the maths.
Yeah. It's interesting how so many of the themes are familiar. I've just taken some notes here. Cost of living, energy prices, Queensland delivering for the, now LNP, but the Liberal Party, and candidate selection, always fraught. So, some things change, some things never do. Andrew, the Liberal Party wins in 49 and doesn't lose office until 1972. So where the predecessor parties, United Australia Party, the Nationalists, had faltered, for various reasons, but there wasn't that longevity in office to build an organisation. This was the chance, wasn't it, to really build up an organisation behind the political party. How did this manifest?
Yeah, it's interesting. So by 1961, there's this great profile of the Federal Liberal Organisation in The Nation magazine, where they profile the staff of the Federal Secretariat, and they describe that organisation is the single biggest element behind the Liberal Party's electoral success. And whether or not that's accurate, and I'm inclined to think there are other reasons as well, but it's telling that they would say that when at the beginning of the 1940s, it's the Labor electoral machine, which is the envy of the Liberal groupings around Australia. And then 20 years later, that situation's completely reversed. And one of the big organisational innovations the organisation makes after 49 is the creation of what's called the Staff Planning Committee, which begins a bit before the 49 election and is composed of the General Secretaries of the state divisions plus the Federal Director. It's effectively, on the surface, an information gathering and sharing committee, but in effect what it is the great strategists of the Liberal Party around Australia coming together and knocking heads and coming up with short-term and long-term political strategies for electoral success. Their political appreciations are the great product of that committee, sort of named after a military appreciation, assessing a battle or a conflict. And they really, it's interesting, when you read the minutes of those meetings, they tell you a couple of things. One, contrary to what a lot of the organisation founders felt at the beginning of the party, the state divisions value their autonomy, and it's actually the state autonomy which I think is the key to the long-term success of the Liberal Party, because it gives them the flexibility to run campaigns that best suit the needs of their state divisions. That's somewhat counterintuitive to what the early founders thought would happen. They were envisaging something more centralised. But I think even more important, when you read the minutes of those meetings, it's quite clear that the framework that Menzies sets up in 46 and 49 really provides the heuristic and the intellectual framework wherein everything else follows. And in many ways, it's that liberal identity, it's the liberal philosophy, and overlaid by the external factors, which is the Cold War. It provides them with a sort of a simple message, simple ideas of private enterprise, anti-communism, which today they almost sound like platitudes, but at that point in time, they're almost sort of small, important truths that guide the divisions in the party from 49 right through to the end of Menzies' career. And I think it's those ideas that are the driving force behind the consolidation of the Liberal Party's success ultimately.
Now, Andrew and Zach, we have reached 3:31, so it's time for our audience questions. So the first question I have was, what was the international response to the election? Did the world care about what was happening in Australia? Now, Zach, you've already spoken about what was happening in Britain and that there was some interest in what was happening in Australia and whether it was a good sign for Britain or a bad sign for Britain. Obviously, Attlee would have been a bit disappointed. But, yeah, what were your impressions of what the international community was saying about this Australian election? Big change.
Well, it's interesting because it was different interpretations that were sort of projected onto the election result in UK versus America. And both countries very much paid attention. So for UK, as we touched on, it's all about the future of the Anglosphere, whether the Anglosphere is continuing down the path to socialism. Menzies gets all these sort of congratulatory letters after he wins the 1949 election. Many of them are from Britain. He obviously knows a lot of people in Britain. But one of the more interesting ones he gets is a book, I've just done it as our book of the week, from a English MP called Ivor Thomas. And Ivor Thomas had actually been a low-level minister in the Attlee government, had actually been responsible for carrying out the nationalisation of airlines, something that Chifley tried to do in Australia but was ruled unconstitutional. And having done that, when the Attlee government then turned its attention to start nationalising the steel industry, Thomas said, enough is enough, I can't deal with this. He leaves the ministry, ultimately crosses the floor and becomes a Tory. So he's sending Menzies his book, sort of a personal journey of a denunciation of socialism and why it's all wrong and all the rest of it. But then for America, it's very much viewed through the Cold War lens. It's front page of the New York Times, Menzies' victory, with a big photo of Menzies. There are only 2 photos on the front of the New York Times in this edition. It was still expensive to put images on. And one of them is of Menzies. And they really see this as this victory of this hardcore anti-communist. And this is the same year that you've had the communist victory in the Chinese Civil War. You've had the explosion of the USSR's atomic bomb. You've had the Berlin airlift. All the geopolitical things are starting to turn towards the Cold War. And the Americans are really heartened that they'll have a strong ally in Menzies.
Andrew, another question we've got here is around the 4-year terms, 3-year terms, the electoral cycle. I mean, Menzies was facing elections every 3 years, sometimes even shorter terms. He used all the sort of political techniques available to him, as you would, to suit your side of politics.
Yeah.
How did he cope with the 3-year term? And do you think, have entertained extending the term, or was it just, it was the nature of our system and we, face the people every 3 years and bear the consequences?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, my gut tells me is that Menzies was a Democrat and he would have preferred the Democratic option, which was the flexibility of the 3-year terms or less. So there's the 55 election, which comes right after the 54 election. That's a result of Menzies' political mastery over the communist issue and taking advantage of a divided Labor Party. So he had mastered the art of politics by that point of view. And I think from his perspective, that flexibility not only has political advantages, I think he would also say it has advantages for the benefit of the Australian people as well. Because ultimately you want government to serve the people, and elections give governments mandates to respond to whatever the public wants at a particular point in time. 3-year terms and the flexibility of the Australian system compared to, say, the presidential 4-year terms where it's on a fixed date, I think give a democratic flexibility that adds, I think, a bit of democratic strength behind the way the Australian electoral system works compared to the more rigid system of, say, fixed 4-year terms that you see in the presidential.
Yeah. Another question we've got here, Zach, is about the Senate and control of the Senate. It's always a contentious issue, and we don't seem to have governments controlling the Senate much these days. But did Menzies have control of the Senate, and was getting legislation through the upper house as difficult back then as it is now?
Well, the short answer is no on both fronts, but this is the crucial transition period. So the 1949 election, the changes that happen are not just the doubling of Parliament. It's actually the introduction of proportional representation for the Senate. So it used to be effectively winner takes all. There would be 3 senators for each state up for election at each half-Senate election. You get 3 votes, so inevitably one party would tend to win all, and that's what had happened in 1946. The Labor Party had won all the seats in every state apart from Queensland, where the coalition won all the seats. And because of that hangover, the Liberals were never any hope of actually winning the Senate at the 1949 election. Menzies ultimately goes to a double dissolution in 51 to win control of the Senate and manages to do that. But it's interesting, he's able to get the Communist Party Dissolution Act passed through that hostile Senate. Labor is not willing to actually vote down, even though it will later campaign for no in the referendum. It's not willing to vote down the Communist Party Dissolution Act. But that introduction of proportional representation opens the door to all the minor parties that we've since had. But it would never have been the same situation back then because you had an uneven number of senators being elected for each state at each half-Senate election. You had 5. So you would still have a winner, whereas now with 6, it tends to be 3 left, 3 right, and that automatic stalemate.
Yeah. This is, I think, a good question for you, Andrew, based on the conversation around candidates. The role of the veteran in the 1949 election. And quite a few of the new Liberal candidates had come out of World War II, were veterans. Were they campaigning as such on the basis of that background and experience? And did people vote for Menzies because he had veterans as candidates? Was that sort of part of the Menzies vote?
I think it was part of the Menzies vote. I mentioned the stat before of the 38 new Liberal members of Parliament, 29 were veterans. If you compare that to Labor, I think there was about 19 new Labor members. From memory, only 1 or 2 of them were ex-servicemen. So the Liberal Party is seen as the veteran party.
Yeah.
Many of its key personnel had served. I mentioned John Carrick before. He had served. In our previous podcast, I talked about Donald Cleland, who was the first federal director. He was an ex-serviceman. And he's an interesting figure because I think he demonstrates what binds a lot of those veterans together, which is a need to make sure that the future is different from the past, that this is a generation who had been born, had experienced the Great Depression, had served in the Second World War. For Menzies' generation, which was a bit older, born in the 1890s depression, had served in the First World War. You have these 2 generations who have this idealistic sense that something has to give, something has to change. And that is, I think, the real historical substance behind a lot of what Menzies is talking about when he's talking about a future, a liberal future versus a socialist future. And the veterans play an enormous part feeding into that campaign.
Yeah, that's really, really interesting. This is a hypothetical, and I know historians hate hypotheticals, but if Chifley had won in 49, he'd been re-elected, how different do you think Australia would have ended up being?
Well, you can speculate on whether there would have been as much economic growth in the 50s and 60s. You can talk about whether there would have been more of a mess to clean up like Thatcher had to do, basically fixing a lot of the mistakes that Attlee had done in the United Kingdom. But a couple of the more tangible ways, I think, that Australia would have been different is, first of all, home ownership would not have risen in the way that it did in the 50s and 60s. The Chifley government had made it very clear under the Minister for Post-War Reconstruction, John Dedman, that they weren't interested in facilitating little capitalists to own their own home. They were more interested in providing state-owned housing where you'd sort of rent directly from the government. And the flow-on consequences of that would have been huge because Menzies manages to reshape society so much that by 1972, when Labor finally win, they've got Whitlam appealing to the middle class because he had to, because Australia was such a middle class constituency. Whereas when Menzies comes to power, it's the opposite. It's that more than 50% of the workforce are union members. So you're going to have to get union members to vote for you if you want to win office. But then a little aside of just a really tangible example where we know it would have been different is that if Chifley had won, we would have gotten television earlier. He wanted to rush it through, whereas Menzies wanted to delay it. But it would have been ABC only, like the British system of BBC only that lasted until the 80s. So we would have had no commercial networks.
Tom Switzer, who runs the Centre for Independent Studies in the Menzies Watershed, he writes a chapter about Menzies' continuation of quite a lot of the Chifley agenda. So there were certainly things that remained the same irrespective of the changing government. So one would have assumed that Chifley would have continued with them too. Things like the Snowy Hydro was a Chifley era project, started then. Obviously Menzies really implements it. Things like the mass immigration program of the post-war era was very much started by Chifley. So we can't bucket him too much, but I mean bucket a lot. But
Menzies,
there's continuity and change.
Yeah, Menzies kept the good, and he'd been a really early advocate for high immigration. He'd been saying this in his Forgotten People's speeches. But the high immigration and economic development based on big public works programs could only have gone so far. To really unleash the economic prosperity of that high immigration and high birth rate, you needed private enterprise to flourish. And that's what wouldn't have taken place under Chifley. And another thing that Menzies pointed out about things like the Snowy hydroelectric scheme is that while individually they might be really good, if you're going to base an economy around government projects, at a certain point, you're going to have to direct people where to work. You're not going to have the freedom of the employee, as he dubbed it. And that's true even of the system that we had in place where migrants, post-war migrants, were actually contracted to work their first couple of years wherever the government sent them.
Yeah, indeed. Just on your reference to John Dedman at the 49 election, after he had sort of lambasted Menzies' attempts to create little capitalists out of these homeowners, John Dedman actually loses his seat at the 49 election to Hubert Opperman, who is a famous cyclist, and he becomes a real political hero, but had been a national sporting hero. So, he paid the price for that jibe, didn't he? Andrew, someone's asked about the lessons of the 1949 election for current political parties for the election next year. Can you suggest any lessons that they should heed or shouldn't heed?
I don't know if this is a lesson so much as a funny observation. I was listening to the John Henry Austral recordings from the Melbourne University archive, and I was thinking that this guy is the podcaster of the 1940s with his soliloquies and monologues about everything that's right or everything that's wrong with Australia. And it got me thinking a bit about the influence that podcasts allegedly had in the US presidential election. And I think the strength of those podcasts and the strength of John Henry Austral, the thing that connects them is that they both gave listeners a worldview. No matter what policy issue they were talking about, some which could be very different from the other, everything was tied together with a fairly coherent understanding of what kind of country we want Australia to be, what our values are. And that framework ran consistently right through the campaign. And I think you tend to see a bit less of that from politicians today.
Yeah.
Certainly the more technocratic approach of every individual issue has to be decided on its merits. What do the experts say about this? What do the experts say about that? I think the benefit of that holistic approach, which you saw in that 49 campaign, is at its core, and I say this as a technocratic economist myself who's spent time in the bureaucracy, at its core, everything comes down to values. And I think that was the great insight and strength of the Liberal campaign and Menzies' leadership. Yeah.
And yes, and politics these days is pretty managerialist and technocratic. There's, you don't have those election policy speeches like you had in the 40s these days. I mean, well, maybe you do to your party faithful, but certainly it's not trending on, YouTube, is it?
It's not. It's not. And it's interesting. So the Vernon Report in 1965 is almost the beginning of the new technocratic age. And Menzies' response to that report is almost sort of his last great hurrah in Parliament, I think. And he makes the point that, economics is important, but it doesn't have the answers for everything. And I think he's right.
We have a good question here sent in by one of our audience members. The 1960s was a period of great change. The Beatles, Rolling Stones, Carnaby Street, colourful and fascinating clothes. Up until 1972, there were 4 prime ministers, Robert Menzies, Harold Holt, John Gorton and Billy McMahon. At the end of 1972, a great political change occurred. People like me, that would be the asker of this question, not me, Georgina. People like me had not known of any other federal government for 23 years. I was young. Was I entitled to feel excited? Hadn't the old government run its course? Wasn't this democracy in action? Well, Zach, would you like to have a stab at that?
Well, it's interesting, the contrast that it was the Liberal Party that was exciting and youthful in 1949, and it's felt by a lot of people in 1972 that it was no longer, that it was very stagnant and all the rest of it. There's a couple of responses to go into that. I mean, obviously Holt when he replaced Menzies, when Menzies finally retired, really did try to bring a fresh face to government, abolish the White Australia policy and do a lot of changes around that. And the 72 election's also interesting because just like we've talked about the results in 49, it's not all one way. It's certainly not a Whitlam landslide. From my memory, it's WA there's actually swings to the Liberal Party in 1972. So there's never going to be 100% of people satisfied with an election result. And it's really interesting that we write these narratives of these watershed election victory where, 51-49 two-party preferred. There were a lot of disappointed people on this day in 1949, and there were a lot of disappointed people in 1972.
Yeah. I mean, Andrew, was there a sense that, Robert Menzies is in office for 16 years the second time around. The Liberal Party kind of grew old with Menzies through that time. I mean, it was obviously brand spanking new in the 40s, but by 66 and then into the 70s, he was, by the time he retired, looking like a much older man.
Yeah, that perception is definitely there. And you can see it definitely in Donald Horne's book, The Lucky Country, where he portrays Australia as almost a stagnant society in which he pins the blame on stagnant leadership. In some sense, obviously, when a party is in government for that long, there's definitely an element of truth to that. But what's also interesting, I think, is the amount of change that Australian society underwent during the Menzies era. So he comes into government when the British Empire, British imperial connection is still strong. When he leaves in 66, America is now the most important partner to Australia. When he goes into office, the principle of White Australia is pretty unquestioned. When he leaves office, White Australia is crumbling, and it crumbles, I think, most significantly under Holt, and then Whitlam kills it off for good. He undertakes the most significant sort of post-war migration program, which really sort of changes the social fabric of Australia in a good way. And when he enters office in 49, there's still an enormous amount of political and legal discrimination against Indigenous Australians. And when he leaves office, they've on the eve of achieving full political and legal equality. So to me, what's interesting, and you say this from hindsight, of course, is how much change Australia underwent during the Menzies era. It's actually in many ways, socially, economically, culturally, the biggest change Australia undergoes since maybe like the gold rush of the 1850s. Yet Menzies is still often regarded as this quiet, white picket fence, nuclear family, nothing much happens, period. Couldn't be further from the truth. And maybe that says something about the importance of political communication, which Whitlam certainly jumped on in 72.
Yeah, that kind of radical triumphalism. I mean, Menzies it wasn't him. Whereas there certainly was that in spades with Gough Whitlam. I guess that leads into this next question. Zach, would Menzies succeed as a politician today? What's changed the most about how our elections are fought? I mean, wow, lots has changed. Lots is still the same. He's still right on a ballot paper with a pencil.
I think Menzies would do a lot better in a 2025 election than he would have done in, say, a 2016 election. And it ultimately comes down to that issue of podcasts. That's what Menzies was great at. It was explaining... He
was the Joe Rogan of the 1940s, was he?
Yeah, he was explaining issues with detail and nuance. And that's why Menzies is so difficult to quote, not just because Menzies quotes are so long in and of themselves, and we always pull our hairs out here at the Robert Menzies Institute about that.
We always wish for a pithy Reagan quote, but we get a paragraph of Menzies, which is still good. But yes, pithy wasn't his thing.
But because he's unpacking all of that nuance, if you snip down what he's saying into like a single sentence, it's never really going to capture the essence. He was not a soundbite politician. So I don't think he would have done well there. But he was also great at overcoming misinformation. I mean, he had to deal with the Brisbane outright lie. And it something that really was so pervasive. I even had people growing up who still believed in the Brisbane line allegation that Menzies had plans to abandon Northern Australia to the Japanese, even though Japan hadn't entered the war and he was still relying on Singapore and all the rest of it. So it shows that there are cycles in politics, and maybe we are coming around to something that's a bit more familiar in the 40s than it is familiar to 20 years ago.
There's something about public speaking, about the voice, about the, oral communication that, Menzies used incredibly effectively. Town hall meetings were so important. He used radio. Of course, in the 50s, TV starts to become important too. Yeah. How do you win an election now? Is it through your verbal communication, or is it the 3-line slogans? Or, is it a long-form podcast like Donald Trump used during the presidential election in the US context? Or are we just wanting a little TikTok that a few flashy images and, associated with an influencer?
Yeah. And nothing is focus group in the 1940s.
No.
John Henry Ostrill was not created out of party officials going to focus groups and saying, what do you want to hear? It's purely from the mind of the scriptwriter. And I think that does say something about politics then and politics today. Yeah, I think in many ways Donald Trump has broken the rule book on political communication. And whatever his legacy will end up being, I hope at least one of them is the end of the sort of the focus group, sound bites, risk-averse approach where you don't want to give an opinion for fear of there being a backlash as a result of it. And maybe part of the problem today is there's just a plethora of avenues to get information from that there wasn't in the 1940s. Part of the reason why political rallies were so big then and they're not today is because there just wasn't as much to do socially. So you'd go down to Hyde Park or you'd go to the local Liberal Party branch meeting just because that was something to do on a Saturday night. So just the interaction with people in the live physical setting, I think, was necessarily conversational in style. Whereas today when you're listening on a computer or the radio or the television, that interpersonal element is gone. And I think that also plays a role in the way political communication's changed.
Our last question, we've got 3 minutes to go, so I'll try and get this one in quick. In the 49 campaign, Menzies argued that Chifley is afraid to smash communism. We actually have one of the handbills here in the museum, which says exactly that. Soviet Russia had been on the side of the Allies. Russia had defeated Germany in the East, and the Menzies, in his campaigning, has gone on to say the Liberal Party says communism is treason and every real communist a traitor. Was this an argument by Menzies that was extreme and portraying the then Labor government and leader by association as extremists with their association with communism or their failure to smash it?
Well, first off, just a bit of historical context is that no one was more acutely aware that the Soviet Union had not been reliably on the side of the Allies than Robert Menzies. He was Prime Minister in 1939 when the Soviet Union signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Agreement and then assisted with the Nazi invasion of Poland. So Menzies, in the early part of the war, thought of the Soviet Union as a pseudo-Axis power. And yes, it fought to defend itself with lots of American aid during the Second World War once it was invaded in Operation Barbarossa. But as soon as that alliance of convenience was over, it was taking over Eastern Europe. So the idea that the Communist Party of the Soviet Union was an expansionist power during this period, I don't think is in any doubt. The question about the sort of morals of banning a political party, banning the Communist Party, and then also affiliating Chifley with the Communist Party, that's partly to do with that coal strike that we've already talked about, because Chifley himself admitted or tried to frame the coal strike as communist inspired, yet not only would he not intervene to do something about the Communist Party, he wouldn't even intervene to allow secret ballots in union elections. And in 1949, there was a royal commission here in Victoria on ballot rigging for the Communist Party in union elections. So these were live issues where a lot of the context really gets lost 80 years later.
Indeed it does. Look, we are almost at 4:00, so a big thank you to Andrew for coming on Afternoon Light Live and to Zach for coming on. It is his job, so thank you anyway. That's it for this week's episode of Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute. Please make sure to subscribe and catch up on our latest online content on our website or on Twitter, LinkedIn or Facebook.